can you raise your hand so we can recognize you and take your question? Christy, thank you very much. I was just about to ask you to ask your question. Christy's just entered her question into the chat, and she's asking a representative from National Treasury to comment on the status quo around zero-based budgeting and how far along is planning for this. When will it be implemented and at which ministries? May I direct that question to DDG Shishi or Sheila to answer?
Sorry, it's just some technical issues there.
No problem.
Yeah, I mean, there are other colleagues from the Treasury. I'm not sure. I'm not necessarily keeping a lookout on every single person. But we announced in the February budget, the Minister of Finance announced that we'd be piloting zero-based budgeting in the departments of the Treasury and public enterprises. It's a small start. And in addition to that, we've highlighted the fact that we're conducting spending reviews. And really what the spending reviews are in that context are going into the pre-existing spending programs and the existing baselines to really review what's happening, what it's producing, and how efficiently it's doing it in departments. As I said, we're starting with relatively small pilots. There are some limitations to zero-based budgeting, the biggest of which is related to the internal financial capacity of departments as well as the availability of data in respect of that function. In other words, it's not a one-size-fits-all. For example, the kind of requirements in the health sector tend to be quite different from the kind of requirements in the police, for example. Some departments are more capital intensive than others. Some departments spend more money on salaries than others, and so forth. So as we go along, I think we will gradually unpick those things. But that is essentially where we are at this stage.
Thanks, DDG. There's a question from Philip, and it's directed to National Treasury. So if one of the colleagues can answer from Treasury, it's in the chat. It asks about where Treasury is at in evaluating the scope and rate of the HPL tax, as it was recommended during the February budget public hearings that were held. And it's the questions from Philip from the Global Health Advocacy Incubator. So if one of the colleagues from Treasury could please respond to that question.
I don't know if Momo's still here.
I can't see him online.
This is his area.
It is his area. Is there anyone else?
Yeah, look, Philip is correct. The matter has come up in public hearings in Parliament. It's unfortunate, as I said, that it looks like Momo is not here. So we'll have to come back to him with the finer details on that. But that is something that it's not new. It's something that's been there, sugar tax and so forth. In particular, that tax on sugar. So I think we have responded positively to it in the sense of saying that we will continue looking at ways that upscaling this sort of levy. But obviously, the main focus here would probably be on the promotion of healthy lifestyle. In the grand scheme of things, it's not entirely sure or certain to me how much money it would bring in probably some, but it could have a positive impact in terms of healthy lifestyles. But we'll have to come back, I think, on that, Kailash, on that from Momo and his team. Thanks.
Thanks, DDG. Any last questions or comments before we take the summary of the discussion? Any last hands, last opportunity to ask your questions? None? Okay. We did ask colleagues to enter their answers for how they think the key finance, the key priority should be finance. And some of the answers that we got was a wealth tax, which Momo talked about, looking at, joint revenues and looking at infrastructure and borrowing through taxes, a combination of curbing expenditure, encouraging investment, creating more jobs, consolidating certain government departments and reducing public spending, and then improving spending. So those are just some of the answers that we did get from colleagues. I am going to ask you to use the same Menti-link to please evaluate your experience of this meeting before you do leave. I'm going to hand over now to Gary Pina. Gary is from the Human Sciences Research Council, and he has very graciously agreed to do a summary and overview of the discussion for us, picking out the main points and recommendations, and also perhaps if he's heard a way forward. Gary is also on the Civil Society Advisory Group to National Treasury for the pilot project. Gary, if I can hand over to you. Gary, are you able to activate your mic and your screen? Hi, Gary. We can't hear you or see you. Please, will you turn on your mic and your screen? Oh dear, I'm not sure why Gary is not able to come on. We would have loved to hear his summary of the discussion. Could I perhaps ask one of the advisory group members to call Gary and see if he can get onto the platform to do the summary first? Okay, Gary's calling me. Just a moment. I will be back with you shortly.
Thank you. Thank you, Jill.
Colleagues, that was just Gary calling me to say if Jacques can please assist him with unmuting his mic. He can't unmute it. He's tried several times from his side. So Jacques and the IT team, please do assist us. Gary's trying to make his
if he can just try again, because he has to unmute himself. You can just imagine the chaos we would have if we unmute people and they busy in the kitchen and the bathroom. So he can unmute. He's got the rights. So
okay, Gary, you can unmute. Jacques says that you can unmute from your side. Gary a few seconds to try and get his mic unmuted.
If the mouse button doesn't work, you can use Control-Shift-M as the shortcut key to unmute. Maybe it might be something related to that, or the spacebar.
Thanks, Jacques. Gary, Jacques says you can use the spacebar or the Control-Shift-M to unmute yourself.
I think he's just rejoining.
Okay. Apologies, colleagues. I did make offerings to the IT gods, but at the last moment, we are having some technical difficulties. Please bear with us. I'm sure Gary will be on shortly. Jacques, is Gary on? Has he managed to reconnect?
Does not look like it's.
Just flip the order. Hi, Gary, is that you?
Hi, everybody. It's Gary here. Can you hear me?
Excellent. Welcome, Gary.
Okay, thank you very much. I had to just exit and re-enter. It seems that unfroze things. I'm going to go through this as quickly as I can. It's not, I must confess, a summary. It's more like an overview. But I think the themes will emerge as I try to go through my notes. The first topic, colleagues, from the first panel addressed was what improvements can be made to the budget to deal with the challenge of long-term fiscal sustainability. We had several presenters, and I'll just go through the details of what was said. First of all, from the Child Rights Coalition, investment in child development, which I'll abbreviate to CD for convenience and speed's sake, should be a national strategic priority. It's also a constitutional right when it comes to children. The problem is that children or child development is never as a national priority. It's absent from the national discourse, although there are, of course, budget allocations that do benefit child development. It was suggested that CD is our best chance to get back on achieving our NDP goals, but there's a need for aligned budgeting for high-yield sustainable returns. There's a dependency here on policy coherence and inclusive, transparent, democratic processes to ensure aligned and supportive budgeting. There's a need to ensure equal and optimal CD. So there needs to be a whole of society and a whole of government approach. I think you'll hear these things coming through. You'll recall from the morning, these are some of the themes that came through. Inclusive development is there in policy, but it's not evident in budget. So there's not always an evident that increased allocations to education or health or ECD are evident in outcomes, which seem to be deteriorating. There's a need to prioritize universal access to inclusive CD, and that is dependent upon stewardship by a capable and developmental state. We need to ask ourselves, why is our human capital foundation eroding? We need skilled practitioners and all the necessary ingredients to bake this cake. There's not always an integrated understanding across government spheres and across all sectors about what is entailed, and there's need for high-level leadership so that we have a shared understanding, a shared knowledge, shared systems, and that there is accountability. So some of the recommendations for implementation, I think they were well summarized in the slide. So I'll just refer to that in the report back. There's a need to establish consultative policy and budget dialogues for developing coherent child-centered policy and short-term priorities, need to strengthen human resources for child-centered development planning, provision and monitoring, strengthen systems to ensure allocation and efficient spending of public resources to implement agreed priorities, strengthen accountability mechanisms for resourcing these agreed national priorities, and strengthen government-wide monitoring and reporting on progress when it comes to these collective goals and priorities. In other words, is there a return on investment? A need to ensure institutional mechanisms and coordinate monitoring, especially the suitability of resourced and a capacitated office for child rights across all spheres of governance to ensure aligned and child-centered budgeting. Then looking at SAICA's inputs, they noted insufficient time for preparation for submissions for this and other consultations, and I think that was acknowledged up front due to perhaps some of the changes in the timeframes because of unusual circumstances this year and last. Concern expressed that NEDLAC, which should be the primary coordination and policy formulation and agreement forum, has been sidelined in effect, if not in actual process. So in other words, agreements reached at NEDLAC don't always find their way into the budget and into government programs of action. An emphasis here on, while commending government on budget transparency, there's a need to consider a feedback loop when it comes to how we take account of the significance of the Auditor General's reports of persistent underperformance. What are the consequences of that? Is there an adequate opportunity for joined up oversight to ensure that there is accountability? Policy certainty is needed, it was suggested, and this came through in other presentations as well. Do we have real consistent long-term planning? Many short-term and medium-term plans, but do these always link up to our long-term plan, our national development plan? Some of the issues identified are some blind spots from the budget, such as SOE bailouts, which tend to deplete contingency reserves intended for natural disaster relief. Water and sewage provision infrastructure should be prioritized. I think this has come through in other submissions as well, and a concern that the GEPF is underfunded. This relates to previous concerns raised. A concern here that lawlessness are growing, but there's less expenditure on law enforcement agencies. There should be a focus on dealing with corruption and maladministration. And there's I think a tie-up here later on with utilizing the funds recovered here for some of the social spending priorities. An example here of the New Zealand budget, where departments should motivate annually for excess funds. This could lead to healthy competition, and it might lead to better budget discipline over the medium term. Some specific recommendations: that only value for money expenditure with demonstrable need should be authorized. A question about whether we adequately monitor projects and whether or not that feeds into budget allocations. Do we place enough emphasis on ensuring budget discipline? And this need for joined up oversight and accountability, follow through there. There was also some concerns about tax revenue and tax rates being comparatively high in South Africa. This was Bruce's submission. The need to close the tax gap, crack down on delinquency, and expand the tax net rather than increasing tax rates necessarily. Spending on SOEs versus social expenditure. How do we revisit this imbalance and these sometimes off-balance sheet or unexpected, unplanned expenditures? There's a concern about weak capacity to implement, and there was a suggestion for partnerships with the private sector. Zero-based budgeting was raised here. As we know, it's come back in Q&A. A look at enforcing some hard choices rather than continually top trimming budgets, such as, and there was, I think there was approval for some of the government efforts to confront the public service wage bill. There was a commendation for Treasury not being guilty of adventurism. The budget is a key element in national credibility, and it should be underpinned by realistic projections, because that leads to credibility of the national sort of plan for how we tackle our priorities. And there's a need for finding an appropriate balance between paying debt and investing in growth. There was a nod to Operation Vulindlela. I'm not sure that I had that right, but it was generally suggested that, you know, this plan is supported, but it will take time to bear fruit. Some particular recommendations is, one was a fiscal driver's white paper. It would eliminate some of the current guesswork that goes in to responding to the budget, and it would help us, I think, focus on a whole of society approach. If there is this kind of white paper, there's a need to de-risk fiscal policy. So what are we going to do specifically about some of our funding risks, like SOEs, particularly ESCOM, for example? We need to stop funding programs that aren't working. Do we have the discipline to do that, or do we have an accountability mechanism that allows us to do that? Steadiness in monetary and fiscal policy is a public good. Again, stressing that credibility is essential. We need to lower borrowing costs. We need to look at the role of business in partnership with government, and again, re-emphasized emphasis on oversight to improve performance and accountability. There was then also a look at some innovative approaches to reducing financial poverty and growing human capital production. Some of the recommendations here were, as I understood them, financial and budget literacy being grown, a need to cut red tape, and then to consolidate and make the budget more coherent. Some of the issues that came up in panel discussion or discussion after the panel was the central coordination role of NEDLAC was recognized, but perhaps the need to improve its practice of playing that role. We need to use that platform more effectively, to be more inclusive, and to expand the opportunities for consultation that it offers. But also these kinds of virtual consultations can feed into that. It's an opportunity that NEDLAC could consider. There was perhaps a recognition that CD should have a place in this central platform that is NEDLAC. How do we avoid externalizing or socializing costs when we need to increase spending on social needs? We need to develop an inclusive growing economy for job creation, increased investment, and to address inequality, unemployment, and poverty. Need to address structural economic reforms to enable economic growth. How do we adopt a whole of government approach and move from sector allocations to overall priorities that address our overall strategic goals? So again, a nod here to the National Development Plan. Concerns expressed about AGSA's role. Should it stick to financial auditing? Does it have the capacity to undertake performance monitoring and auditing, noting that it wasn't AGSA that really detected state capture? Also an acknowledgement that after DPME was established, performance of government actually declined, and we had state capture. There is a concern with integrating approaches to budgeting, but how do we do that when the structure of government is essentially siloed, because governments are divided up into departments? So how do we coordinate? What are the practical ways in which we can do that? And then how do we I think one of the key questions was, how do we ensure that oversight and accountability is more joined up and more streamlined when much of these oversight and control mechanisms are siloed? So government departments come before oversight and accountability bodies as departments, rather than perhaps as sectors or clusters. Is that something that needs to be considered? There was a suggestion that so NEDLAC priorities are agreed, but then government announces a different plan when it comes to economic recovery. We also need more on what is working and what's not before we rush into the next budget cycle. So how do we focus, and this might be one of those opportunities, this platform, is how do we focus on the medium term rather than the annual? Maybe that would enable us to be more strategic. I know I'm perhaps going on a bit over time, so please, Chair, halt me if you need to stop me, because a little key priorities. There was a note that the economic context, we have a mild recovery, whereas our competitors are outperforming us once again. We've had a decade of deindustrialization. We've stagnated since 2010, whereas what we need is to find a balance between increased needs for social spending, but capital expenditure has been declining for 2 decades. How do we sort of rebalance that imbalance? Outcomes are weakening. We need to shift from short-term to medium-term objectives. We need to revisit our approach to SMEs and how do we incentivize self-employment? What do we think about public-private partnerships as a mechanism for some of these solutions? Fiscal concerns, we need to ensure that the economy grows, but what are the best ways to do that? How do we balance fiscal concerns and inclusive growth? There was a reference to government's 3 scenarios, the active, passive, and progressive scenarios. Priorities here are managing spending expenditures, and there was acknowledgement that there's been some attempt to deal with the public wage bill. How do we deal with admitted increased expenditure on education, but how do we increase and strengthen outcomes? How do we improve outcomes? Some suggestions about opportunities here of the sectoral opportunities of transport, telecoms, and electricity to increase competition, but there's a need for increased governance. These were some of the suggested areas for emphasizing or prioritizing selling shares and partial privatization in these sectors, like the model of telecom. Particular recommendations included shares in SOEs, investing in infrastructure at 5% of GDP, and there was some discussion about that. Then when it came to community-based programs, particularly for persons with disabilities and prioritizing them, they seem to have fallen off government's explicit radar. They seem to have been included in other government programs, and they are not named explicitly, or then that people and government programs don't necessarily make explicit the need to identify this category of vulnerable people and how their needs are being met. And then there was a question of public disinvestment in PWD services. Sorry, those are persons with disabilities. There's an increased dependence on social grants and on families, leading to increased vulnerability of persons with disabilities. Dedicated budget for PWDs, despite the assertion that there was increased capacity to deliver these programs if there are public-private partnerships. We need to acknowledge that universal access design standards are not being met in practice. For example, public transport is increasingly inaccessible to persons with disabilities, and they're becoming increasingly invisible to society. They're increasingly excluded. And this has been exacerbated by COVID. What has happened to the mantra of leaving no one behind? Rural persons with disabilities are perhaps furthest behind. There's a concern here about disinvestment by international donors, and what can government do to provide catalytic investment to ensure dignity and equality are respected as rights in reality. There's a need to recognize the value of community-based initiatives, and is there perhaps a way for the NDA or Department of Social Development to focus on funding community-based programs, which seem to be working. There was some disagreement about the value of top slicing budgets. There was seen as this was an opportunity for top slicing budgets to achieve impact. What about looking at the district development model as a possible basis for planning and ring-fenced funding? What about using funds recouped from corruption? What about considering some BB for this sector and its needs? And then looking at parental systems and strengthening referral pathways through community-based interventions. Then looking at this pilot from the Western Cape local government department, looking at revisiting functional mandates and reforming some of the assignments. There's a pilot project ongoing. How does this affect risks for the MTEF? What are the opportunities in the green economy? But if then the question arose about looking at local government capacity to deal with funding streams here, there is in the Western Cape government presentation wanting to acknowledge a continued commitment to budget policy principles, but how do we deal with evidence-based decision making? So, in other words, let's look at the pilot, let's look at what is the actual impact, what are the outcomes, let's look at the cost of employment or the public wage bill. There's a need to explore alternative service delivery models and shared services models, investing in green infrastructure and looking at sustainable revenue sources, leveraging revenue generating abilities from this. And then from Hila about some of disabilities. What about food security, which affects increasing number of people, especially during COVID? Are grants adequate? We know that the Treasury is looking at social grants continuing, and what about making those more sustainable? Concerns expressed earlier about increased social expenditure and affordability, but hidden hunger is being worsened. There's a need to address underlying systemic inequalities and poverty, particularly as they affect poor people who really eat what's affordable and what's available. So diet is not always a matter of not always a matter of choice, but what's available and what's affordable. But how can government incentivize healthy nutrition so that we can decrease the increasing burden of food-related non-communicable diseases? We should all bear in mind that the whole of society bears the cost of failed food systems, and we should look at affordable food as one of our constitutional rights. And so some of the recommendations here are, again, policy coherence and improved regulation. There's a request that we look at the health promotion levy, noting that health taxes do work. They have disincentivized, for example, sugary foods, and we can look at this as a way of increasing funding to age by subsidizing nutrition foods and re-incentivizing healthy options. But again, looking at a comprehensive package, not just doing one thing, but looking at joined up public policy. And then we moved on to the discussion where we looked at for example, programs for persons with disability and food security should be national priorities, but then how are those spread across government? How do we make intergovernmental coordination work effectively? And I think that applies to all of the issues that arose here: persons with disabilities, food, the green economy. What are the appropriate points of intervention? But how do we make sure that we're dealing with a joined up approach so that we don't have a siloed approach to each of these initiatives, for example, or if these are agreed national priorities, how do we ensure they don't just become more repeated and failed programs or projects that fail because of lack of coordination, lack of monitoring? How do we ensure accountability for delivery? Again, one example here is to prioritize water supply infrastructure. That would contribute, for example, to both increasing employment, boosting economic growth, and opportunities for increased food security, for example, as well as meeting a fundamental constitutional right of access to water. Zero-based budgeting came up, and noting that it's being piloted, that spending reviews are being undertaken across government departments, but noting that data is an issue here, and that some departments are more wage-focused while others are more CapEx-focused. So, the value of how government looks at zero-based budgeting and the ways in which it can be piloted effectively, and the ways in which government department spending reviews are undertaken might vary depending on the nature of departments' expenditure patterns in the past and their structural constraints. I hope I've covered some of this. I'm sure that when we do a more detailed report back in writing, some of these points will be captured and rendered, I think, a little bit more coherent, recognizing the relative incoherence of some of what I've shared with you, and some of the things that struck me and I've tried to capture. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, colleagues. Kailash had to step out quickly. I just wanted to hand over to Edgar now to just give a word of thanks before we finalize and close. Please go ahead, Edgar. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Prudence. Let me just get to see what's wrong with my video here. It's taking a while. I hope it's working. Okay. All right. No, thanks. Yeah, I just want to, I'm not going to really say much except to express my appreciation for this session. Firstly, thanks to Gary for the summary. And we have noted all of the comments that have been made. We had an opportunity to ask and seek clarity about some of the suggestions and recommendations people were making, and we appreciate some of the thoughts and recommendations and responses, rather, in that regard. I think that, as I said at the beginning, this is an unusual situation, and we are hopeful that next time around we will have more time, and that we will have what I call returning to regular order in terms of the budget process. And we will continue expanding and getting a wider range of views on a number of these issues and discussing and debating them as we go along. I do want to express my appreciation to the panel members who took the time to put together their presentations at very short notice. So to Patricia, Sharon, Olivier, Margaret, Lawrence, Malcolm and Zama and John, much appreciated for your efforts in this regard. And finally, I also want to thank, well, not finally, I not quite last, second to last, I do want to thank Kailash for your hosting of this event and for directing the program in a professional and organized way that you did. It is much appreciated. And then finally, to the team that was involved in making these arrangements, and helping us hold this session. Jacques and Prudence and Sheila and others who are involved in all of the arrangements. Many thanks for your efforts doing so. So with that, I want to wish everyone the best from my side, and I hope that we can continue to improve and take this process further and make it more effective over the medium term. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Edgar. Thank you to all the DDGs. Thank you to all the Treasury officials who stayed the duration, and to Jacques. Jacques has been, responding to messages, SMSs, emails, and everything. Thank you so much for making this possible. And to our advisory group members as well, thank you, colleagues. Thank you for seeing this through. And to Gift, thank you for the support as well. And with that said, I know we are over time. I would like to officially close the meeting and appreciate all the participants. As Edgar has already mentioned your names, we appreciate you, and feedback will be given on the inputs received, and we will be posting them, and a summary of what took place today as well. Thank you, colleagues. I now render the meeting closed. Thank you.